All right, good evening. We'll go ahead and get started. So just take a moment to generate a positive intention, positive motivation for your time this evening. Trying to think about whatever it is that you are interested in as broad a way as possible, that is authentic and meaningful for you. So you just reflect on what it would be like to accomplish whatever goals you have for your time in the course, and think that those benefits apply not only just in terms of your own life, but that everyone that you interact with would also be benefited if you developed greater peace of mind or deeper familiarity with positive mental states. You are the immediate beneficiary, but everyone that you come into contact with also benefits. So try to just widen your motivation and think about intentionally including others. All right. So we are picking back up in the section on the obstacles to meditation, and particularly the section relating to what we called negative mental states. And it is to kind of backtrack in a way. It's important to recognize that this idea of negative mental states is not kind of a moralistic framework. It doesn't relate to, rights or responsibilities or social convention or some sort of pre-existing societal, ethical, or moral framework that's sort of meant to, help people work cooperatively or get along, or help society to function. These mental states were observed by the Buddha to give rise to suffering, and all of the states of mind that the Buddha observed, reliably, repeatably gave rise to suffering, he referred to as, well, in English, they've decided that we're going to translate it in, a variety of ways, one of which is negative mental state. Another way is afflicted mental state. Another way is disturbing emotion. And so when we say gives rise to suffering, we mean two things, two or maybe three things. First is that when the state is present in anyone's mind, they themselves, under the influence of that state, are in a painful state. They themselves at that time are suffering. Secondly, under the influence of that, the arising of that state, the actions that they engage in, actions of speech, actions of the body, and even just mental actions, often are the kinds of actions that cause harm to the people around them, people who are absorbed in concentrations on love and compassion and generosity, those are not the people that are killing other people. Those are not the people that are stealing, harming people with their words. So the people who are doing that are people who are experiencing afflicted states of mind, like jealousy and craving and maliciousness, ill will, these sorts of disturbing states of mind. And then, if we were to say that there's three, then the result, the karmic result of those actions that are engaged in under the influence of these disturbing states, they, karmically speaking, the ripening result of those actions is further suffering. So the suffering arises in the moment when the afflicted state is present in the mind. That very often motivates an action, and then the karmic ripening result of that action is future suffering. So the Buddha simply noticed that this is how these mental states unfold. And so he provided a framework for understanding the states that give rise to suffering reliably, repeatably, and then the states of mind that give rise to happiness reliably, repeatably, and categorize things based on his own direct observation of what gives rise to what. Now, buying into that, in a full way, you could say might require the view that the Buddha is not ordinary, is an enlightened being. Also, though, we can investigate in our own direct experience, at least those first two. We can begin to become more and more deeply aware of when I am under the influence of these states. Is it true that I find it painful? Is it true that I find it depriving me, robbing me of peace and contentment? And is it true that the way that I relate to others is problematic, is not beneficial for them, causes difficulty in my relationships, so on. And by examining, in that way, we can get, a pretty good sense of conviction that the Buddha is really onto something here. And then, that third, the karmic ripening part, either we decide to take that on board, or we decide to hold off and maybe try to learn more. And, that's a very personal sort of thing, but there are ways that we can validate this framework in our own experience, I would say. So just wanted to kind of backtrack a little bit and provide that additional context for these states. So were there any questions, either from just that or from last week, that would need to be addressed before we move on? Nope. All right. So we addressed attachment as the first of these afflicted states last week. And, so we talked about how attachment is a mind that exaggerates the observed or perceived beneficial or pleasant qualities of an object of knowledge, something that can be cognized, and then gives rise to a sense that we never can tolerate being separated from that object, because we view that the pleasurable aspect, the happiness, to be out there, separate from me. And in order to be happy, I must bring in external sources of happiness into my experience. And so when that is operative in the mind, as of course it is for all of us at various times, when we try to meditate, we'll often find that we daydream, that we think of other experiences where, that are more exciting, and so our mind will kind of go off to objects of attachment. And then there's anger. And so there's anger is you could say that anger exists on a spectrum, just like attachment does. And its root is aversion, is just like when we observe. So in a way, it's the opposite of attachment. Anger, attachment and aversion are opposites. Aversion isn't the same thing as anger, but anger has aversion at its kind of core, which is, instead of observing a pleasant quality in some phenomena, we observe something that we dislike in some phenomena. And we then think that my happiness is threatened by contacting this aversive phenomena. And to protect my happiness, the only option is to separate myself from this aversive phenomena. And then when, really, there might be some agitation in the mind initially when we are observing that phenomena, but, if we can be separated, then we wouldn't necessarily give rise to anger. Anger more so arises when we can't be separated, when, that aversive stimulus is just ongoing in our experience, even for a few minutes, an hour, what have you. Then we start to build resentment and the agitation, and we can give rise to anger in that sense. And then, it's also true that there's different ways of thinking about that in terms of the historical Buddhist context, because we're stuck with a lot of English words that don't map neatly onto Tibetan or Sanskrit. So when we talk about anger in terms of, in the Buddhist context, maybe more so in relation to the three poisons, there we're talking about not just, the kind of energy in the mind that wants to escape an aversive stimuli, but really the wish to cause some harm. So it's a stronger, when the Buddha says that, anger is one of the three root poisons, that kind of mental state really comes along with the wish to cause harm, which can certainly be a part of, and it's the wish to cause harm, or the thought to cause. It isn't like you then actually have to say or do something, but it's the kind of impulse to lash out with, your words, to wound with your words, to wound with your, and the wounding doesn't mean, of course, with words you can't wound physically, but it means to wound mentally or emotionally by being insulting, by being degrading, or even just acting like, oh, if I just ignore, I'm mad at this person, so I'm going to ignore them. I'm going to, the goal is to hurt them. The goal is to wound in some way, by giving them the cold shoulder. So this idea of harming or wounding doesn't mean punching or striking, but it means intentionally wanting to cause them to suffer in some way. And it very often can come along with kind of how we've described it here, which is that energy of aversion. But also it's true that the energy of aversion can arise, just like when we open the fridge and, somebody ate, or we don't even really know what happened. Like the thing that we thought we wanted to eat that was in there isn't in there anymore. Maybe it went bad and somebody else threw it away because it went bad. We don't really know. We're not like, oh, you ate my thing. We just know that this is where it was and it's not there and I wanted it to be there. So this aversion arises, this kind of agitated state arises. And then, of course, if we find out that our coworker intentionally ate perfectly good, delicious food, then we might yell at them, then we might lash out. And that kind of is the wish to cause harm, you know. So it can be a little bit nuanced in terms of how it manifests. But basically, we are coming into contact with something that we believe to be unpleasant, and we feel that the only way that we can relate to that is to be separated, to not be experiencing this. And this is an obstacle to meditation because, again, just like objects of attachment, when we begin to quiet the mind, begin to try to focus the mind, it's these really charged memories that tend to pop up in the mind kind of on their own. And so the things that people have said or done to us that we are angry about will naturally be part of the objects that pop into the mind that are taking us away from the object, the intended object. So resentments, perceived slights, and so on are very often things that we will find are distracting us when we want to meditate. And of course, too, the more that state of mind, even outside of meditation, the deeper that habit is of blaming other people, retaliating, etc., the deeper that tendency is in the mind, the more kind of perturbed the mind will be just in general. The mind will the mind is not calm, the mind is not collected, the mind is not peaceful. And so when we try to meditate, the default state of this and really any of the other negative states, because we're practicing them also in daily life, they're creating kind of a baseline level of agitation in the mind that is not what we want, not the ideal, because we're trying to cultivate a very, very deep, concentrated, still, peaceful mind that's very alert but also very relaxed. And the degree to which we are practicing these afflicted states is going to make that job more difficult, irrespective of whether the specific memories are coming up or not. Any thoughts or questions before we move on? So next is deluded pride, which again we sort of addressed, where we said it's not feeling good about one's accomplishments, but it is comparing oneself to others and feeling superior to others on the basis of actual accomplishments or perceived accomplishments. So it's a comparative mind where we hold ourselves to be better than other people who we think haven't done the things that we've done, aren't as good at the things that we've done, aren't as good at the things that we can do as we are, etc. So it's a way of kind of feeling good about ourselves by putting other people down. And again, this kind of would be related to anger in a way, because we we might feel like, oh, how dare that person say that to me, or because we feel like, oh, that how I'm this great, and then this person dared to correct me, or something of that sort. Okay, thoughts or questions? So it can have sort of a flavor of aversion with deluded pride. So the next is envy or jealousy, which is again a mind that is comparing, but this is sort of and it too is in the sort of wheelhouse of anger, because it is in a way the opposite of rejoicing. With jealousy or envy, when we observe other people having either circumstances that we would like, that we think we would enjoy, or objects that we think we would enjoy, rejoicing would be observing that and then thinking, oh, how wonderful that they were able to create the causes and the conditions to experience, being able to get a new car, or upgrade their kitchen, or whatever it might be. But the mind of jealousy or envy, instead of that response, has the response of, why not me? Why didn't this happen to me? It should have happened to me. And so it's a way of, instead of being happy at the happiness of others, and it's all kind of silly, because it is happening to another person, and so you know instead of just feeling happy at their happiness, we kind of are annoyed at their happiness, because we want that for ourselves. We want to sort of take what is happening in their lives and take it for ourselves if we could. That's kind of doesn't mean that we actually act on it and go steal something. This is a mental karma, of just feeling unhappy about the success or the happiness of another person because it's not happening to oneself. Okay. So then the last of these five afflicted states is really the biggest, the most impactful, of these, and because this is called ignorance, and it empowers all of the afflicted states, and so we can recognize that without ignorance there would be no attachment or anger or jealousy or deluded pride. But then we can also talk about it as kind of its own unique, conceptually at least, its own unique afflicted state, which and as a topic, this particular topic can be the most subtle and most difficult topic within Buddhist philosophy, and the antidote to it, because as I mentioned, it is what empowers every afflicted state. And so the Buddhist approach to overcoming affliction partly is to learn about kind of what they would call conventional antidotes, things that we can apply day to day, that we can get better at applying day to day as afflicted states are arising. But there are, we've only covered 4 afflicted states, and if you go into more detail, there are secondary, tertiary. There's a lot more, more than 4, many more than 4 afflicted states. So it partly we do try to think about conventional antidotes, like I said, for example, rejoicing. When the mind of envy comes up, we can instead try to cultivate a mind of rejoicing. And the more that we practice rejoicing, the more that we will find that envy and jealousy are decreasing in the mind. However, it's not possible to completely eliminate all afflicted states, even if we could learn and practice every single opposing positive mental state. Still, that would not completely 100% eradicate these afflicted states. It would serve, and it's helpful as much as we can to tamp down, to reduce the arising of these afflicted states through that method. But as long as ignorance is operating in the mind, then, however much progress we make in tamping down the delusions, the seed, the imprint, the tendency is still going to be there. And, over the course, and then we're going to die, of course, and then there's going to be another rebirth. And, the work that we've done in reducing, in this life, that karma carries over, in a way, but it doesn't carry over perfectly. It's not like if a person spends one lifetime really working on reducing, then for all of their remaining lifetimes in samsara, they are a person who has very little afflictions. We are influenced by our environment, by the people that were around, and also these karmic seeds. They don't, they just don't ripen in that way. There is carryover in karmic tendencies, but it's not like you perfectly inherit every single thing exactly as it was before. So over time, given the presence of ignorance in the mind, I would say, given enough lifetimes, those tendencies are going to grow stronger and stronger because fundamental ignorance is still empowering them. So the ultimate approach from the Buddhist perspective is really we just need to get rid of fundamental ignorance because it empowers all of the delusions. And when you do that, it's different. Karmically speaking, you can't undo that particular realization. If it is direct and non-conceptual, it's permanent. And so that is different than just practicing love a lot, practicing compassion a lot, practicing rejoicing a lot. Those are things that we do and that we must do. But this is still a different category of effectiveness when you look at multiple lifetimes, when you look at the scope of training, over the course of multiple lifetimes. So really going into detail on this, though, is kind of outside the scope of this class. Next month, as I mentioned, there is the Friday night class is Introduction to Mindfulness. So that it really probably won't come up much there either. The class after that is Buddhism in a Nutshell, and there will be one class, so like a 90 minutes just kind of on that topic in Buddhism in a Nutshell. So if you are looking for, for kind of more detail on that. But the idea is that we are ignorant of how things really exist. We are ignorant of the way in which we exist, phenomena exist, and more importantly than that, we don't know that we're ignorant of the way things exist. We believe that we are perceiving everything accurately. So it's easier if a person says, "I don't know Spanish, can you teach me Spanish?" That person is going to have a relatively easy time learning Spanish. If a person thinks they understand Spanish and they are totally butchering the language, but they're really convicted about it, it's much more difficult for that person to get to a place where they're speaking Spanish correctly. You have to present them with a lot of evidence and come at it from a lot of different, perspectives to really change their mind. But still, it's doable, right? It's possible. It's just more difficult. And that's the Buddha observed that that's what's true about how we think we are observing. We think we're doing it without any errors. We think we're doing it correctly. So it's a really self-perpetuating, because we don't really seek. If we think that, then we're not motivated to seek it. If we know that we're moving to Spain and we don't speak the language, we're really motivated to figure out how to speak Spanish. But if a person doesn't know that they don't know how to do something, they're just going to persist in doing it and be misperceiving how they're doing it, which is why cyclic existence is so kind of self-supporting and pernicious, is because very few sentient beings actually get to a point where they question whether or not ignorance is part of their mind, and then really develop the motivation to overcome the ignorance that's part of their mind. But and I mean, there's other places where you can. How to See Yourself as You Really Are is a book. If you want to read that, that kind of I mean, it's not super easy. I mean, it's a little bit dense, but I mean, any book on this topic is going to be a little bit dense, but it's a good place to start if you are interested. Okay. Any other thoughts? No one's asked a question yet. So, any questions? Any thoughts?
Hi, Dondrub. I remember someone years ago saying that we tend to have one particularly strong affliction. Is that generally something like you would work with a teacher with, or
Yeah, I mean, it's usually they say that that things that for a given person, I mean, of course, there's no ordinary person who's completely free, because that they haven't trained, and it isn't possible that they're completely free of any of the afflicted mental states. But if you just think about people that you're like, oh, that person, they're really quick to anger. But maybe they don't really care so much about stuff. They don't like accumulate stuff. They don't, they're not really interested. And so attachment for them, isn't so much of an issue. There's going to be circumstances where attachment comes up, but really when you look at their life, their activity, the choices that they make, you would say, oh, well, for them, it's kind of, they struggle with anger. But another person might be generally kind of easygoing, but they might think a lot about objects of attachment. They might really, really struggle with objects of attachment and so on. And for some people, like their deluded pride is very, so yeah, it's definitely true that for any of us, there's things that are predominant and things that are less noisy in our lives. So, certainly if a person has a teacher, so I mean, I think, of course, introspective awareness, as we've talked about, is part, developing that as a skill is part of Buddhist spirituality. And the more that we do that, the more that we probably can uncover, these patterns within our own lives. But certainly, if you're around a teacher, you know, sufficiently, then yeah, you certainly you could ask them to help you. Say like, what are you observing? What does it seem like? Because generally, if we start, like I said, no one is completely free. No one's like, oh yeah, I don't need to work on my attachment. That's not a valid statement for anyone. But starting with, at least initially, in some ways, like the things that are the most powerful for you can be a good strategy. And then, because that's what is going to be most responsible for that, that kind of baseline agitation in your mind. So, and it's, kind of the thing that's going to make ethics most difficult. If a person is really, really quick to anger, then that's what's going to get them into trouble with their relationships. But if another person's really, really attached to things, that's what's going to get them into trouble and make it more difficult to follow, ethical restraint and so on. So beginning of putting the most amount of time and effort into what seems to predominate, is a good strategy. Any other thoughts or questions? Okay, so we're going to shift gears now and look at the parts of a given session of meditation, kind of breaking down. So we're irrespective of what a person is choosing to meditate on, kind of what are the parts of any given session. So, and there's different ways of thinking about that. So it kind of depends on how much you want to take on board. We've talked about, in the first class, I think we talked about the posture, we talked about an altar, and so on. So technically, if you're looking at it from the historical information about this process, they would say that you start with making sure that that space that you're going to use is tidy, is clean, maybe doing a little bit of spot cleaning, wiping, dusting, etc. And just checking before, at least once a day. And then of course you've got, depends on what it is. If it's a public area and you've got other members of the household, then you probably want to check it more often. If it's like a room and it's private, then I would say every morning, you do a little bit of cleaning. And then the second step would be to set out offerings. Now, that's not true for every session necessarily, but it's at least true, in the first session, the beginning of the day. You might do water bowls, you might do flowers. We talked about, the different kinds of offerings. So at least for the first session, you would set out some offerings. Again, if whatever you want to take on board or not is up to you, but just talking about it from the historical perspective. And then you would, so again, technically, you would most likely engage in you would either engage in setting your own motivation, just kind of, thinking about it in whatever way you want, or it's very common to use what are called preliminary prayers as a way of setting your motivation. If you go to fpmt.org, you go to their foundation store, you can search for a text called Daily Prayers that will give you some examples of preliminary prayers that you can use. Or if you prefer, you just try to set an altruistic motivation on your own. Because your session is only going to be beneficial to the extent, the extent to which your motivation for doing it is beneficial. If you, want to impress someone by being able to say that you meditated on some sutra or something, and you just want to be able to go into work the next day and impress someone, then it might be the most amazing sutra or most impactful verses, but your motivation wasn't great. And so for you, spiritually, it didn't serve any real purpose. Whereas at the same time, if you're just doing a breathing meditation, but you think that you're doing it in order to create the causes and the conditions to completely, to develop fully qualified calm abiding, to completely eliminate your delusions, to arise, in the state of enlightenment for the benefit of all beings, then something that's very basic is incredibly powerful from a spiritual standpoint. Just literally attending to the breath, which you're breathing all day, every day. So you would set your motivation. Any thoughts or questions? Okay. And so that is something that you would do prior to every session, whether you're doing one session that day, or two or three, you always set a specific motivation for each individual session. It doesn't have to be extensive, it can just be very brief, but and then the next step is the actual session, the 10 minutes or 15 minutes of compassion meditation or breathing meditation or whatever it might be. The actual session is right after you set your motivation. And then the fourth step in the process is dedication. So I think we've done that. Sometimes I ease into that with the introductory classes, but I think we've probably done it once or twice. And here again in daily prayers, they will also give you examples of dedication prayers. And this is sort of the bookend to motivation. This is, in a way, one purpose that it serves is to try to prevent your kind of egoistic mind from co-opting your spiritual practice, because there's a real danger that we might, that our practice can feed into deluded pride, for example, or we might think, oh, how selfless am I just gave up, my time, the weather's nice, my friends are at the beach, they're being silly, they're wasting their time, they're being selfish, whereas I am meditating on love and compassion for all sentient beings. And so there's a real danger, that our egoistic perspective can take over even our spiritual lives. So dedication is when we don't hold on, we try to let go of having done anything for for ourselves. We try to think, whatever I've done in this meditation, may it ripen for the benefit of others. May it not, may it benefit other sentient beings. Of course, inevitably, invariably, because we, in our own minds, deepened, a constructive habit pattern, then there is benefit, in our own mind. But through dedication, we're trying to actively counteract the view of like, oh, I did this amazing thing, because we just think, oh, let all of that ripen for the benefit of others. And again, just like, motivation and dedication, they both can be really expansive if you have time, if you have the interest. Of course, you can go through in a very detailed way, but it can also be more brief. And you can do both of those in brief ways some of the time, and then expansive ways some of the time, depending on, maybe on the weekend it makes more sense, you've got more time. So you can do these, and dedication practices are really beautiful, and can be very moving if they're really, really extensive. But if you're doing 2, 3, 4 sessions a day, maybe if you work up to that, if you get to that point, maybe you do extensive dedications just at the end of the day, and you do short dedications for the other sessions. But there's no real wrong way to do it. I would say the idea is that you want to just think about all of the beneficial effects that might ripen from the positive karma that you've created, and then just think that it does ripen in all of those really, really expansive ways. So those are the 4 kind of, well, we alluded to cleaning the room and setting out offerings. So if we include those, then those are the 6 steps. Those actually aren't in the course, but I feel weird not mentioning them, so I always just say, well, clean the room and maybe set out some offerings if you want to. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, this is kind of slightly off the meditation track, but not entirely. At the end of the day, is that a good time, to meditate, in the sense that we're kind of reflecting on the day? Or anything special at the end of the day that would be good to add to that?
Yeah, so historically speaking, if a person feels comfortable with the idea of purification practice, that's usually done at the end of the day, like you're saying, because we can reflect on the day, and the kind of checking in with our intention to have lived ethically that day, to not have sort of given into the influence of the afflicted states. And then of course we didn't do that. If we did that perfectly, we'd be enlightened. So we fell short in some ways, and we fell short in some ways every day, and we will continue to. But purification is a way of trying to do better, trying to make tomorrow a little bit better, to make some progress on that. Not to just be like, oh, well, yeah, I blew up at my colleague today, but it's fine because I was tired and they were a little bit snippy. Still we're responsible for the harmful words that we said, and so we want to purify that, and that in and of itself, and if a person's not there yet, then that's, of course, that's fine. There's no it's not. We offer a purification meditation 5 days a week at 9 p.m. On the YouTube on Zoom. So if a person just wants to even just check it out, just like listen, you just show up and just listen if you're interested. It can be done more, kind of more historically Buddhist in a way, or it can be done kind of more in a more secular format. Because the historical way of doing it is visualization of a particular enlightened being and the mantra that goes along with that particular enlightened being. But a person may not want, may not feel ready for that or interested in that. So the real psychological essence of it is the four opponent powers. So generating a sense of regret at having, engaged in something that wasn't, in line with our ideals is the first, because again, like I said, if we just make excuses, if we just make excuses for being rude, what have you, then we'll never change. We'll just be like, oh yeah, when people are snippy, I'm going to be a little bit aggressive and that's fine. But we need to realize that it's not in keeping with our ideal. So we generate a sense of regret that we engaged in a non-virtuous action. So then we engage in the power of reliance. So, and here, this is what, where it can be kind of more or less Buddhist. So with regard to reliance and with regard to the remedy, with regard to reliance, we counteract that by generating bodhicitta. So because we're relying on kind of a new positive tendency or habit to, by cultivating a sense of refuge and a sense of bodhicitta, we're relying on that to protect against the negativity that we'd created. And then you have the remedy, so the kind of the four R's: regret, reliance, the remedy, and then resolve. They're also called the four opponent powers, but they just all happen to start with R. So the four R's, so regret, reliance, remedy, and resolve. The remedy is also something that can be more or less kind of historically Buddhist. So with regard to Vajrasattva meditation, Vajrasattva is the name of the particular enlightened being that I alluded to, but with that's the remedy. So in that historical context, the meditation where you visualize Vajrasattva, you do the recitation of the mantra, that's the remedy because you're engaging in a remedial action. If you don't feel comfortable with that, then you can do a meditation on what would seem like the opposite of what you're regretting. So you can, instead of engage, so this is a remedial action. So instead of relying on Vajrasattva, you can think, well, I'll visualize the person that I yelled at, and I will generate thoughts of loving kindness toward them, and that can be how I do that. And then you have resolve, which means that for a specific period of time, you kind of say, I won't I won't do that again. You can't say, I'll never do that again, but you can say, for the next 2 hours, I'm really going to make sure that I don't raise my voice at anyone. I don't say insulting things to someone. And then gradually over time, you want to lengthen the time frame that you're giving yourself, but you always want to give yourself a realistic time frame, and don't just say, "Oh well, yeah, I'll never," because you will. I mean, we all will lie again. We will, raise our voice again, but we can watch our mind really closely for an hour, 2 hours, in some cases maybe a day. Um, so psychologically, you have regret, um, reliance, the remedy, and resolve is a way of working with negative habit patterns, and that's and like I said, there's ways of doing it that are really Buddhist, and then there's ways of doing it that are a bit more secular. But that's typically what's recommended at the end of every day, if possible. Um, we also have to be careful too of like, am I too tired, and so on. We have to be skillful about when we choose to meditate. Um, any questions? I went off on a tangent for no reason, but
Oh, that was really helpful. Thank you.
okay. Any other thoughts or questions? Let's see. Anything that would be helpful? Any questions? I think we've covered most of material. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything in my notes. Anything that would be useful to think about? Nope.
If we have the moment, I know I don't want to like take advantage here, but because ignorance is something that's such an extensive topic, also seems to be my leaning, unfortunately. I know you recommended the book you recommended seems to be by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Are there meditations specific to that, or meditation in general is specific to that? to the recognition of our own, what is real, as opposed to our own delusions.
It's a bit, well, as I said, as a topic, it is the most subtle and most difficult topic, within Buddhism. So, in that sense, what's tricky is that what Buddhism is saying about that is that what we're meant to do really is just understand that we are misperceiving, and how we're misperceiving, but we don't then. So the goal is to see through how we're misperceiving, and what the simplest way of doing that. So Buddhism doesn't say, "Oh, well, this, the apple or the chocolate cake that you are attached to, it isn't." Buddhism doesn't say, "Oh, well, it doesn't, it really exists in this other way." um, all that they say is that your attachment is something that you are bringing to your act of perceiving the chocolate cake, or whatever, carrot cake or ice cream or Brussels sprouts, whatever you are, attached to. Um, and so, because other people, they would observe that same object and they'd be like, I could take or leave that. It doesn't, some people prefer key lime pie, some people prefer gelato, some people don't really like sweet desserts at all, and they might want like a biscuit, or something, to finish their meal, and to feel like they. So the fact that different people can observe the same object and have very different responses is an indication that the response that we are having is something that we're bringing to our act of perceiving the object, even though we kind of feel like we're powerless but to respond to that in that way. The fact that other sentient beings, even though we think they're crazy, for how could you not like chocolate mousse or whatever, but there are people who don't, because they are bringing a different set of mental causes and conditions to their act of perception. So His Holiness kind of generally recommends to try to observe exaggeration. Where are we, is my view balanced? Is this something that I'm like, well, yeah, this is pleasant, um, or this is challenging. This is not the most fun I've ever had, but can we also simultaneously see a bigger picture? Can we say, okay, well, yeah, this is, I enjoy chocolate cake, but if I eat it all of the time, I'll get sick, it will negatively impact my health. And so there's other aspects here that are not, there's a lot of fat, there's a lot of calories, there's, not a lot of nutritional value. Um, and so can I be sort of balanced about it? Like, yeah, if it's there sometimes, it's fine to have it, but I'm not going to like think about it on my drive home. If I get to the fridge and the last piece is gone, I'm not going to like, be in the fetal position in the bathroom because there's no chocolate cake in the house. So noticing where we're layering an exaggerated response, um, in terms of things, and the same is true of all of these. These are all exaggerated states: jealousy, anger. These are all states where, yeah, there's something there that seems a certain way, but if our response to it is really strong, really, over the top, and we're not looking at a complete picture and thinking, well, there's other aspects to this. This isn't entirely pleasant, and this other thing that seems unpleasant isn't entirely unpleasant. I can think about a challenging situation as an opportunity to practice patience, as an opportunity to develop resilience and fortitude. And so, without difficult circumstances, I wouldn't have, how could I become skilled at responding with patience? How could I have resilience if everything just kind of works out all of the time? And so that helps us to experience a difficult circumstance without freaking out and feeling like this is intolerable. I must, this must end by whatever means. So whatever I have to do, whether it's ethical or unethical, whether it's aggressive or, whatever I need to do to make it stop, I'm going to do, because this is not something that I can tolerate. If we have a wider, more balanced perspective, looking at the object from a variety of other angles, then that's not really, but as an entryway, I mean, as a beginning point, that can be really helpful. There's more nuanced ways of thinking about it too, but yeah, Buddhism doesn't say that, like, oh, chocolate cake is actually like this. All it says is that everyone that observes chocolate cake, so to get a little bit more philosophically detailed, the insight that we're trying to have is what's called a non-affirming negation, which means that all we're trying to do is recognize that the exaggeration is false. Buddhism doesn't then posit, oh, chocolate cake is actually this. It just says, my exaggeration to chocolate cake is false. And if somebody hates chocolate cake, their exaggeration is also false. And there doesn't need to be anything said other than all exaggerations are false, because they are not a valid observation of the object. They are a layering on top of the object. So we're not really trying to get to a point where we say, aha, this is true, because we can't really, that kind of means we can't really say that anything is true, because it's, true from what perspective? True from, from a dog's perspective, it's one thing. From an ant's perspective, it's another thing. From, a hell being's perspective, it's another thing. From 1,000 different humans, it's 1,000 different other things, because they all have, so, but it's the same object, it's the same thing. And so the only valid thing that we can really say is that no one is observing it accurately, because they're layering on top mistaken, exaggerated views. And that's all we have to stop doing, is recognize that this is a thing that does exist, and it's observed differently by countless numbers of different sentient beings, depending upon their karma, depending upon their how their body and mind is put together, how it's operating. But it's being misperceived. It's not, however any ordinary sentient being is perceiving it, necessarily fundamental ignorance is operating in their mind, which is why they're an ordinary sentient being. And so necessarily their perception is colored by ignorance and is therefore not fully accurate, not fully valid. All right. Do we want to leave it there? Get out a little. People always get excited about classes that end early. Yes, William.
Just wanted to say thank you.
Oh, sure.
Thank you, Dondrub.
All right. So yeah, so next month is Venerable Katie on Fridays. Introduction to Mindfulness, I think is what it's called. All right. And we have meditation retreats coming up in a week and in 2 weeks with Elaine, who's visiting. So if you're local, those are happening, and of course they'll be on Zoom as well. But really, being there in person, if you'd like to be, is an option. A week from tomorrow, and then the following as well. All right. Have a good night.
Thank you. Have a good night.